There has always been a sense of competitiveness within climbing, regardless of what the motivation of those early mountaineers were. Climbers have always battled against each other and themselves. In fact, it's what makes climbing such a fantastic sport. It doesn't matter if you're climbing Everest or having a go at the latest project down your climbing wall, climbers will always find something to compete against. In 327 BC, the Great Alexander the Great challenged his troops to climb Sogdian Rock in Uzbekistan, using flaxen cord as rope and tent pegs as pitons. This guy was way ahead of his time. A couple of thousand years ahead of his time, I reckon. This would normally go at about 6B+. Fast forward to France in 1786, the first ascent of Mont Blanc, and the first time that we see a real competitiveness in deciding who summited first. French pair Michel-Gabriel Paccard and Jacques Balmat had made the first historic ascent of Europe's highest peak. But after allowing Jacques Balmat, the poorer man, to claim the reward that had been set for the ascent of Mont Blanc, Paccard was angered to hear that Balmat had not only claimed the reward, but had also fabricated the summit report in order to claim that he was the first man on the peak, and not Paccard himself. A story that would be rectified in later years thanks to sworn statements from witnesses on the Chamonix Valley floor. Races against mountaineers continued, and still does to this day, to claim first ascents of new lines and mountains. Although mountaineering has sometimes shown competition in a bad light, it did give birth to the UIAA, or the Union des Associations d'Alpinisme. This was formed under the shadow of Mont Blanc in Chamonix. This was an international federation designed for the study and solution of all problems regarding mountaineering. This included competitions and would go on to play an important role in the development of competition climbing. The UIAA, however, was not responsible for the types of climbing competitions that we see today. In fact, in 1940s communist Russia, a new style and culture of climbing emerged: speed climbing. In 1955, the Russian Climbing Federation decided upon climbing a single pitch in the quickest time possible as a new format. In the years that followed these competitions, they became a common feature of the climbing scene in the USSR. In fact, they got to such a level that in 1976, they invited world-famous alpinist Robert Parigot from France and German Otto Weidmann to compete. This is almost 10 years before the first climbing competitions emerged in Europe. We tend to think that competition climbing started in Europe, while actually it was the Russians who were ahead of their time. Funding for speed climbing in Russia was lost after the USSR dissolved in 1989, but the former states of the USSR have produced some of the best speed climbers of all time. And still, even now, Russia is at the top of their game. So, fair play Russia and the former states of the USSR, you deserve your place in history. You rock on plastic standardised routes. The first speed climbing World Cup was eventually added to the tour in 1998, a full 9 years after the first lead World Cup. In 2005, Jackie Godoff created the now standardised climbing route that is synonymous with speed climbing, and the rest is history. So now let's look at some other disciplines, sport climbing and bouldering. It was the sport climbing scene of the 1980s that led to the inaugural climbing competition of Western Europe. Sport climbing, as well as bouldering, was originally used for training purposes for the big mountains. But by the 1980s, sport climbing was evolving fast, particularly in Central European countries such as Germany, France and Italy. Sport climbing inevitably moved towards a format where climbers could compete against each other as well as the climb. In 1985, the stage was set for what would be the inaugural climbing competition. Two pioneers, Andrea Milano, a strong climber of the 1960s and member of the Italian Alpine Club, and the journalist and writer Emanuele Cassara came up with the concept. They invited the best climbers in the world to an event where they would compete against each other on the Wall of Soldiers in the town of Bardonecchia near Turin. It would become known as Sport Rocchia. With today's climbing scene full of competitions all over the world and taking place almost every week, it's hard to emphasize just how rebellious this organization was compared to the traditional factions that used to run the climbing world. The competition was organized and the best climbers were in attendance. Crowds gathered at the bottom of the rock route. Local TV stations sent their crews, and for the first time, climbing became a spectacle that was watchable, not just through the binoculars spotting dots on the side of the mountain. It was a huge success, with the now famous climbers Stefan Glauwitsch of Germany and France's Catherine Destiville taking the inaugural titles of sport climbing champions. In 1988, having moved the Sport Rocchia to the site of Arco and seeing the damage that consecutive competitions was doing to the rock, the organisers had no choice but to change the location of the climbs to an artificial wall. The following year, in 1989, with the rise of popularity of these types of competitions throughout Europe, the UIAA officially recognised the Climbing World Cup, which would be held over several stages. Not everyone liked this new wave of competitions. Some believed it broke with the traditional sporting values of climbing. However, the ball was rolling and nothing was going to stop it. Throughout the 1990s, competition climbing moved almost entirely to artificial walls. So now let's get to bouldering, and in 1999 the first World Cup was held. Outdoor bouldering came to prominence in the 90s and was ushered in from the fringes of climbing society. Competitions started popping up throughout Europe and America. The realization that bouldering competitions could be held in a reasonable sized building without the enormous structures needed for sport climbing meant that bouldering competitions and gyms became popular all over the world. Up until 2007, competition climbing was governed by the International Council for Competition Climbing, an organisation within the UIAA. So, in January 2007, 57 country federations came together to found the IFSC, the International Federation of Sport Climbing. They brought in new statutes, bylaws and regulations. Paraclimbing? Well, that was introduced in 2008, and Moscow hosted the first event within the Boulder and Speed World Cup competitions. The future of competition climbing is certainly bright as we move forward. Rock stars have been born, and climbing has certainly broken into the mainstream. The IFSC is working with athletes to ensure that their voices are heard and that our sport is constantly changing and evolving. Climbers from all over the world will be competing this summer, and the only question is, who will you be cheering for?